an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. Look at that. It's Friday the 13th. There's all kinds of memes, I'm sure, around this at Queen's Park this week. Welcome in. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics Podcast, and today we are going to podcast like it's 2018. Yep, that's when all this started. It was the date was May the 9th, 2018. And I think maybe on May the 8th, I said to John Wright, there's going to be an election. What do you say we do this podcast thing? And we would do it every day. And John was not in his right mind, nor was I at the time. And we both agreed that we would do this. And off we go. You and I did that for what? It was like 45 straight days.
Yeah, and thanks to your technical abilities, we actually accomplished it. Yeah, it was actually, on reflection, it was busy, but it was fun. If I had any concerns about it, it was that we might not have enough material every day because it was just like day to day to day. But you learn, from our own experience that in every campaign, stuff happens. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the Ledge this week, outside of the Greenbelt and the RCMP and stuff, I mean, even the NDP, when it comes to the unions and their position on Hamas and the Palestinians, I mean, that's an explosion that has happened and will continue to have reverberations. And I would suspect even at the federal level, the NDP is meeting this weekend, and they're going to have to reconcile some of this stuff.
I mentioned, 2018, we started doing this. And recently, I pulled up some of the files. I pulled up the old shows, and I was just listening back. And, to your point where we thought we wouldn't have enough to talk about, we certainly, the shows got longer as we went on, by the way, because there was a whole lot more texture in the campaign. And as you've always said, campaigns matter. But there are certain things that resonated then, and this is more than 5 years ago now, that still have not been addressed or resolved. Hallway healthcare, those kinds of things, where we still have not realistically kind of had that in the crosshairs of the Ford government and dealt with for all the get her done stuff that's going on. And okay, maybe there's a mulligan around COVID and to deal with that sort of thing, but that'll only emphasize some of these things. But when we talk now about Greenbelt RCMP investigation, this has, and I think we mentioned this last week, derailed. How do they get anything done with this hanging over their head? I mean, as well-intended, he may clean house, he may do whatever he wants to do. How do you get anything done with that hanging over your head?
Well, it's government, and you have to. I mean, they'll set an agenda, they'll move forward. In many ways, it's the stuff of the fog that now envelops you. In other ways, you have a plausible way of saying, can't talk about it. Sorry, got to move on to the people's business. We'll wait and see what the investigation has. I mean, the Auditor General is now going to look at some other stuff, which will prompt, further questions in all of this. But you can't escape it. And the thing is that you look at the gas plant issues that we looked at in the first campaign. I mean, that stuff went on for years, and it ended up with somebody going to jail. But the point is, it lasted for years. So this is going to hang over the Ford government. It's not like there's a speedy trial with a verdict that is going to be delivered, because there's an investigation, and it'll be extensive. And coming out of that, maybe charges, maybe not, but if there are charges that go to people who are either formally in the office of anybody, or it touches on someone from the Premier's office or from a minister's office or from outside or whatever, it will stay until the next campaign. So there's been floated stuff in the last 24 hours where some people are suggesting that, Doug Ford himself should reconsider what he's doing so that the party can, take over and deal with all of this. That will not solve things.
Well, let me just point this out, though, that when McGuinty stepped down, Kathleen Wynne comes along with that gas plant hanging over her head. She wins a majority. Right?
Yeah.
So the people said, okay, this is taken care of. We still want the Liberals. So somewhere the calculus, I can understand how people would say, Doug, you're in trouble. The caucus is pushing back. His cabinet might be, and there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that, it's not a happy group. Even when he dialed it back on the 21st of September and said, we're going to roll back the Greenbelt decision, all those cabinet ministers were standing a good 10-foot pole behind him.
Well, there's a few things to say to people. If you're talking to the Conservatives at the moment, that is, number one, keep your mouth shut. There's a police investigation, and just don't, cooperate completely, but let's just keep our powder dry on that. Number two, we have a long way to go before the next election, so anything can happen. Number three, you're at 34% of the polls. You need 37 for a majority. You're not at 26 like the federal leader for the Liberal Party's at. We have lots of road to go. Number four, we have an agenda we still have to work on. I mean, just as you rightly said, healthcare. Like, people need doctors, for goodness sake. And rather than changing the channel and turning up the volume, which they tried to do in the early part of this with, we're building houses and blah, 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 which I think we said on this podcast, it wouldn't really work.
Wouldn't fly, right?
In fact, if anything, it brings attention to it. I think what I would do if I were advising there is I would suck back, recalibrate, and actually start fresh with a new agenda. I'm not suggesting a proroguing of the House. They have to get through this session, and whether they come back in the spring with a fresh head, even with an Auditor General's report that might be about to land or whatever, they are going to have to step back from all of the chaos in that office of the Premier and everywhere else and say, okay, let's know that we have to work with this for the next couple of years. But what are our priorities, and how do we, keep the numbers healthy enough at 34 so that when the next Liberal leader comes in, it's not just a pile on, but it's a comparison, so that we can actually go to the people at some point and say, look, at the end of the day, it's about choices of leaders and what you can do to the province. And let's say we even get a minority. Let's say it's 34% and we end up controlling, somehow, or they put together a coalition that, operates. Well, we've got enough to work with like that, because we can say, just remember what happened to Trudeau and how he did with the NDP. There's so many scenarios. So I don't think it's over for Doug Ford and the Conservatives by any means. I just think that when you're in the tornado, that's a good way of putting it. You're in a tornado where sometimes you know a lot and you speculate. You also know some things, and you are really deeply concerned about where it could go. You lose perspective. It is like Ottawa, which takes almost 3 days to respond to everything.
Yeah, no kidding.
You're in a bubble, fast. And what you really need to do is to get some perspective. Sometimes that means not hiring people, but reaching out to people and getting advice and sort of saying, here's 3 things you should be doing. And I'm sure they're doing that. But I think they've taken a torpedo to the side of the ship. But it's not going down. It's just listing, and they can repair things. But I think, to your point, there are issues in this province that need to be addressed, like bread and butter, serious issues. And I'm not talking about pocketbook. I mean, healthcare is huge. And the only thing that I would say to all of this is that in the last Wynne government, and in Dalton McGuinty's days, there was a group in the corner office. They were named Jerry Butts and Katie Telford, who ran the Liberals at Queen's Park, and then they went north to Ottawa. They used to have this phrase, and I hate it, and it's, the spending versus percentage versus GDP. And what it implied was we can spend a ton. We can do just fine. What you now got And it put them in.
Well, that only works if the economy's humming along.
Yeah, right? But it racked up so much of a deficit.
Sure, of course.
It just, and there was also a view that if they tilted far enough left, they would co-opt the NDP voters, which would give them what they needed. And so they took that strategy to Ottawa. And look what's happened. They have a coalition, and they might live by, an agreement in a minority. But the other thing is that they have spent so much money that it's costing, I think it is something like $44 billion a year now to pay on the interest on the debt.
Just to service the debt, yeah.
All of which, or part of it, could have been going to healthcare. So here we are in a situation where Doug Ford and the provincial government and all other provincial governments rely on the federal government for money. And the only way through it is for them to get more from the federal government, which now Anita Anand at Treasury Board is trying to find $15 billion to chop, and God hope it's not from defense.
Well, we know that that's likely. I mean,
$1
billion out of defense.
Yeah. But these are decisions that are made in terms of, the moment and the philosophy of how you're going to manage a government that come back to haunt you. And I don't think we're there yet with the Ford government. Not even close.
So, part of this equation and the calculus is also, focusing on the opposition. Let's agree that Andrea Horwath completely wasted her opportunity in the last legislative mandate, because even with COVID, she never seemed to kind of get her ducks in a row appropriately and properly. Now she's the mayor of Hamilton, and they're playing Where's Waldo with her. I talked to Laura Babcock this week about it on Now and Next. And a year in, Horwath has been, for the most part, an invisible mayor in Hamilton. And it sort of set the tone, I think, for the leadership race, and I put that in air quotes, for the NDP, where there was only one candidate. And I think generally we thought that's not really healthy for the party. But talk about somebody who's made the most of an opportunity. Marit Stiles has done just that with the Greenbelt. She's managed to get the other parties involved, the Greens and the Liberals, although they don't have huge presence in the House. At least you can say it's bipartisan when she starts going to, asking for investigations or however she's pursuing this. She's come out as the unlikely, I won't say hero, but certainly on the verge of being a rock star in the opposition benches. She's proven herself to be pretty effective in all of this in terms of managing not only her caucus, and we can get into the Hamas issues in a minute, but the idea that she's driving the agenda in a way that Horwath never did, or never took the opportunity to do so.
I totally agree with all of those. And I mean, she came from almost nowhere, and the expectations of her were not high at all, because, I mean, she'd basically been a school trustee, if I recall correctly, in Davenport area or someplace like that. And you know what? There's been a clarity to her in terms of this issue. And she has, I mean, it's easy to say follow the money and all that sort of stuff, but she's been handed by the Auditor General and then by the Integrity Commissioner a bunch of information which backs up her suppositions. And she's managed to keep at it in the House. I was interested the other day where they switched tax for a day. Do you notice that? I mean, they were all about the Greenbelt, and then all of a sudden they moved to the bread and butter issues and the healthcare issues, and it really caught the Premier off guard. I mean, so they're playing a whack-a-mole game here, which I think is also good for them to do. But you're right; they've emerged as a party led by someone with integrity and purpose. Now, if you're partisan, you may think otherwise, but to the public, she's done a good job. And it'll be interesting to see then if Bonnie Crombie or somebody else is in the chair after they get into the House, which is a whole other story once you get elected head of the party and then finding a place to go, what that tag team looks like in the House, because she'll be the senior leader. I mean, Bonnie Crombie, if she's in the House, will go toe-to-toe with the Premier any day. And they're already starting to frame her. But what it means is, if she's there, two female, very accomplished political leaders lining up against the party across the ways. And what you have to think of is that if there is a minority situation, then the two of them have enough of experience to put something together to defeat the Conservatives and switch the roles. So, like, I mean, that's there. It's not like Horvath where you kind of go, oh, geez, you know, like, you know, same old story and all that. No. This is potentially potent. So there's a lot at stake here, even at this stage for the Conservatives. But they're on their heels and they're reeling from all of this, and they need to have some outside perspective that goes in and says, okay, these are the three things we need to do.
Focus.
We need to get through by Christmas.
Yeah.
And then we can take it off and we can start fresh with a budget in the new year.
Yeah, they need some early wins between now and Christmas for sure. But let me ask you this, because it occurred to me this week again as I listened to Mart Stiles and watched what she was doing. And to your point, there's been a lot of conversation that Bonnie Crombie is in Doug Ford's head. He's afraid that she's going to be in the House, and you know, whether he wants to use that phrase or not. And they have started to define Bonnie Crombie very, you know, specifically and deliberately. I wonder if that was a mistake because they took their eye off the leader of the opposition effectively and gave her the lane. She just running down the lane while they're focused on somebody who isn't even an MPP, let alone the leader of a party in the legislature.
No, I don't think so. I think you've got campaigning people and you've got people who are in the Premier's office running the show and doing the legislative stuff. I mean, you can separate it out. You have to paint the other person's wagon before they get a chance to paint it, and they're doing precisely that. And then after, let's assume for a moment, and I'm not taking sides in this, but let's assume the front runner is Bonnie Crombie and she gets in. Well, then she has to build a team, and she has to make sure that they're from all of the different groups who were there running for leader. And then she has to find a place to be elected. I mean, like most leaders without a seat, what they'll do even then is go on a listening tour, right? You know, because then it's all about policy and platform and stuff. So it buys time, but you've got to go and do that. That search out for a seat. And John Tory wasn't successful. Never made it to the House. So I think that there's lots of time and lots of place for her to go, but that also leaves the Conservatives open to painting her wagon. And what they've decided to do is go about her personality, and it's all about Bonnie. Mm-hmm. It's not about you. It's about, you know, and that maybe is, we'll see where that goes. I think what's critical for a party, and it could be even Justin Trudeau. Let's talk about that for a moment. I mean, what's happened there is two things. And I've said on this podcast, and I will hold to it, I'm keeping my powder dry on the future of the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau until at least June of this coming year. I've had friends who have said, he's done, he's toast. And they'll come back to me maybe in June and say, see, I told you so. You waited. It's just kind of like, whoa. Like anything can happen. And I think June is the appropriate time because then you've got time for leadership if you want to leave and into the next year and all of that sort of stuff. And the NDP are not going anywhere because they have no freaking money. You know, and Jagmeet Singh is not raising money. I mean, he lives. I think he lives in Toronto while he's living in Ottawa. I mean, he may have a seat in British Columbia, but he lives in Rosedale. I mean, wow. So anything can happen, and I think that's the case with the Trudeau government. However, the two things that have changed in the last month that I want everybody to keep the eye on is, number one, Atlantic Canada has flipped on the Liberals, and a lot of that has to do with the carbon tax, and much of it has to do, the nail in the coffin before the by-election in the Maritimes just took place. The provincial Liberals ran a campaign in one of the provinces based on the carbon tax and all that sort of stuff, but they ran a federal campaign in a provincial riding. It just smoked out the Liberals. But it was Krista Freeland who opened her mouth while she was in PEI and said a bunch of things that just hammered the nail in the coffin there. So first of all, geography is about the federal government and whether you get into power. In order to keep power, the federal Liberals have to have Atlantic Canada, and they're done. Okay, so that's gone. I don't know whether it's going to come back. But the second thing you watch is that the Conservatives are in good position in Quebec, and they and the Bloc are eating now into Liberal seats. And if the Liberals lose parts of Quebec, forget about Ontario being a seesaw for them in the 905. We could be looking at a Mulroney situation, post-Mulroney situation, where the Liberals are completely wiped out. I mean, they're teetering on this, and frankly, I would argue that rather than go for a walk in the snow, the Prime Minister should take a look at the beach and go for a walk in the sand in July and start to move forward with it, because his party may be wiped out if this continues. So I think whether it be Ontario, whether it be federally, you have to keep your eye on the geography of where you are and the numbers. And right now, Doug Ford is not he's got seats in the GTA, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But his power comes from outside of that geographic area, and he's still holding. I mean, the Greenbelt is not playing in Sault Ste. Marie. Corruption might, but then it comes down to the choice. So I go back to this and look at the federal Liberals, and holy crap, they're in really big problems now, but nowhere close to what the Conservatives could be in. I mean, they're not even in the same ballpark. So I think you have to keep an eye on those sort of things, but particularly geography. And right now, the geography of the federal Liberal vote is crippled. Like it may be beyond saving. And the Prime Minister, I mean, if he sticks around, he's a narcissist, or he believes he's the only one that can save the party with his policies, or that he's right and everybody else is wrong.
Then let me ask you this: if that's the case, because we're going to have potentially a federal election and a provincial election here in Ontario pretty close in terms of calendar, right? Does the Poilievre campaign and brand help or hurt Doug Ford, given what he's just gone through vis-a-vis Greenbelt?
I don't know. I mean, there's always been that theory that there's always opposites, right? Provincially to federally. Yeah. I personally, having lived through all of these, I don't think it's a conscious decision on voters to say, well, federally there's this and there's
of course
this.
Not. I mean,
the only province that I see this regularly happen is in Quebec, where they pick winners. And if they're moving to the Conservatives now, they're picking a winner. I don't think it does that much, but I think what it does is it will harbor a contrast that is significant between Doug Ford and the other two parties that are in the House. Because I know that when Poilievre comes in, he's got an agenda, and it will be starkly different from what the Liberals have federally now, and it will be fundamentally different than what the NDP and the Liberals provincially can bring to the table. And that may be a turning point for this country in some of the biggest provinces. We'll see. But I don't know at the moment. All I know is that I think you have to prepare for the scenario of a Poilievre government, or maybe some candidate that the Liberal has at least ekes out a minority and a coalition again. But right now, I think you have to start factoring that into your future decisions.
Yeah, well, the next, between now and Christmas, it's going to be pretty interesting to see how a lot of this plays out, because we're going to, dial it back even to the city of Toronto. We're going to have some sense of what budgets look like for Toronto with Olivia Chow at the helm. We're going to have a sense of who's going to lead the Liberals in the legislature here in Ontario. What's going to happen with this investigation? There's a lot of worms in the can right now, to your point, where, now we start untangling them in earnest probably a good 6 or 8 months from now.
Well, and let me kind of finish on that, because I think Olivia Chow has been a bit of a surprise to many.
Indeed, yes.
And I think a lot of it, now, I mark my words on what I say. I said, when she won, that the biggest issue that you have to watch with is not necessarily Olivia Chow, but her staff. I said at that time, you have to watch whether they have a vengeance that they're going to come in and they're going to take over and they've got scores to settle, or that they are going to dig their heels in and say, Doug Ford, you owe us this, and do that. I said at the time, it's a tone and it's a tactic that you have to really watch. On both of those counts, they have demonstrated the opposite. They've managed to quiet things down at City Hall. They've managed to put people in places that they had to put them in place in order to make that all workable. But the tone and the relationship between the Premier and the Mayor, and the Premier's office and the Mayor's office is actually working. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting thing, and that has to go to the Chief of Staff for Olivia Chow for having managed that very, very carefully. So I would suggest that maybe what comes out of this is not necessarily money for the city, but maybe it's a management of something. And I'm not talking about the uploading of the TTC, but maybe there's a deal that could be fashioned around something that catches people by surprise. Maybe there's an infrastructure play here. And I think that there's enough goodwill that's working on all of this that Toronto and the Mayor could become quite an interesting ally of the Premier.
Who'd have thought that Olivia Chow would be Doug Ford's savior?
Well, and I think it's going to surprise a lot of people. Right? But I have to give her staff, and I have to give the Mayor a huge amount of credit for being completely the opposite to what many pundits thought there would be.
I said right out of the gate, I don't think Olivia Chow is what Toronto needs. I eat my words. I think this is exactly where we wanted to be, and good on her for doing it.
So I think that'll be the next shoe that drops, and that will be a very interesting distraction from what's going on, on their plate right now.
Indeed. Well, I hope you get to enjoy your weekend. My mom's coming to town to meet her 4th great-grandbaby. So,
wow, congratulations. Yeah, I've been following all of that. It's great.
We're quite excited. But and we're going to see Six, the Mervis show, this weekend as well.
Good for you.
Back into the swing of things and getting out and about and seeing folks. So, John, always good to talk to you. That's podcasting like it was 2018. Talk to you next week. Thanks.
Take care, bud.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.